Hello and welcome to the weekly Dinosaw for week 37. So another 7 curious and interesting, hopefully useful things I've seen last week. So the first one, on Thursday there was a huge internet outage. So many of you may not have seen this at all. It was mainly sort of hit US, but it was actually was felt worldwide as well. So 3.5% of worldwide traffic was affected by this. So what this actually was is just to go into how simple it was. So this was essentially a router rule. So there are companies that route the traffic around the internet, and they manage those routers by sending out rules now and again. Now, one of the rules is about packet length, and most of the packets, so little tiny parts of information that go across the internet, are kind of half a kilobyte or 1.5 kilobytes, that sort of thing. So one rule was, like, if you get any like rogue really massive packets, just delete them basically. So this one here, you can see if it's between essentially 99,000 bytes, about that sort of size, then just delete the packets. Or discard them in this case. So that was the rule that went around. Now, that should have just quietly propagated to all of the routers and then done its job quite quietly, but essentially what happened is something went wrong with it, and every time it then saw this new rule get uploaded, it quietly gobbled its own memory until each router fell over. So what that essentially did is, instead of routing internet traffic around the world, it just stopped, and because they all stopped in a certain way, they couldn't be restarted. Anyway, very technical explanation, or not a technical explanation for what actually happened, but what the resulting thing is, 3.5% of the internet's traffic was affected by one small company uploading one erroneous rule to the internet of their packets. So interesting to know about. Again, what happens at a world level when this is actually meant to happen. Somebody decided to do this on purpose. We've seen this on state regimes where they've dropped access to the internet, and this did it. So one line of code basically can actually bring down the internet. So that's interesting. Just thought I'd bring that to your attention. Robot shelf stackers. I don't know about you, but I started my working career stacking shelves at a local supermarket. So this is a sort of a very labour-intensive twist on the digital self, I guess, but also how can autonomous robots help us out? And this is a very non-autonomous robot. So this is somebody sat using a VR headset, stacking shelves in a supermarket. So just really interesting how the future. At the moment, as soon as you've taught this robot a couple of times, it should be learning from you using its machine learning or augmented senses, whatever. So there could be quite a lot of activities that are seemingly quite complicated for a robot or an AI to achieve. But as soon as a human has shown them how to do it in three-dimensional space, it might be something they can do further on. So all those jobs that you thought were safe are now under threat again. So it's just a demo at the moment. So Teleexistence are working on this at the moment, but you can see how well it works. It's kind of neat to know that you could probably be doing your work, however manual, sat at home in a special VR shed. Google has updated, a relatively dull one, sorry about this one, but Google has updated its images search info. So this isn't out just yet, but it will be soon. In that, if you are a photographer or if you own any sort of image that can be licensed, you can now tag that image using HTML code, and then when it is trawled from Google's robot, basically, it will find the image and it'll go, this one is licensable. And not only that, it can actually then display or click on the link that will take you to a website where you can buy the image as well. So there are quite a few images out there that people use in their presentations that are still basically copyright and they're owned by somebody. At the moment, it's quite difficult to figure that out, although you should always assume that everything is copyright. But now it makes it very explicit. So the interesting thing for me is, well, there's no rule to say that I can't just tag an image up to say that it is licensable and potentially put the link to what should be the licensing site to somewhere else. So I don't know what the rules are behind policing where these links go, but that's quite a neat marketing trick somewhere down the line. So good luck trying to find that one. CRISPR-Cas9, one of my favourite things. If you've not heard of CRISPR, it's clustered relatively interspaced short palindromic repeats, I think it is. Basically what that means is it is a cellular innovation, I guess let's call it that, process. And what you do is you essentially set your immune system against itself to try and target different DNA strands. So again, that's probably a load of jargon, but what you can do is like when you have an immune system reaction to the flu, for instance, you've been previously immunized, the flu kind of immune system goes and finds the rogue things it doesn't like and it goes and kills them. That's what your immune system does. You can set that to almost anything. So if you don't want certain cells, or if you want to change certain parts of DNA, you can set your own immune system essentially off to try and find those bits of DNA and snip them and replace them with something else. I'm absolutely butchering what Cas9 or CRISPR-Cas9 is. However, what you can essentially do is you can do gene editing within a human body whilst it's still alive, and those make permanent effects, so that will be passed on to your children. Now, what this one does, it's been shown in mice, is to turn white blood cells into brown or brownish fat cells. So what's really interesting here is there's two things. One is A, it's happening, and B is these white blood cells are the ones that make you overweight and give you diabetes, those sorts of things. And the brown blood cells are the ones you're born with more of when you're born, obviously, and they whittle away and they become replaced by white blood cells after a while. Now the brown ones can burn fat, and the white ones just store it. So if you can turn the white ones into brown ones, they become much more useful. You don't tend to put on weight, you don't tend to get diabetes, and that could be quite interesting. This would have been passed down to your children if you then have children, because it is a permanent one. So it's really interesting where a CRISPR is going on this. And I thought also the really interesting thing is they called these sort of these new brown cells, not quite brown cells, but they're brown-like cells, human brown-like cells, which were called humble cells, which I think is interesting. So in the future, you might find maybe at birth, maybe at 21 years old for your party, you might basically be genetically modified with humble cells. Whether that's politically correct or not, whether the future will want this, who knows. But it's interesting where CRISPR is being used to essentially not just cure things like sickle cell anemia, etc., but it's also being physically turning cells into different types. Apple delays its tracking. So I've mentioned this a couple of times because it's a massive change, and I can't understate how big it will be. But if you haven't seen these before, and you haven't seen this, well, not this slide, but this point before, is Apple are really on their sort of corporate or their product crusade is really about privacy. So when iOS 14 comes out in a couple of weeks' time, it was supposed to have a feature that asked you whether you want the app or website that you're going to track you across the internet, which is what everybody else does. Google, for instance, Facebook does it. So they were now explicitly asking you, and if you don't want it, they'll say, great, we'll shut it down. And of course, if you're an advertiser or if you run an advertising network, and that's your core business that's been shut down right there. So it was supposed to be coming out in 2 weeks' time with the iOS 14 update. Apple have kind of realized that this really does affect everything from app developers to entire networks, advertising networks, so media buyers all the way through. Especially if you're in the programmatic world, then this is for you. So they've now realised that it's super complicated and affects a lot of livelihoods, especially right at the moment when everybody's getting dealing with COVID. So they've delayed it until early next year. It's not going away, and they've said don't see this as an admission that we got it wrong. This is definitely going to happen, but we're going to give you a bit of extra time, so get ready for it. And this was a really good example. I try to sort of throw one of these occasionally of just when you think too much. So I'm really excited about the Elon Musk energy farms, where essentially huge container lorry-sized lithium-ion batteries. And that solves the problem of what do you do with solar power when you need it at night. Obviously, it needs to be used when it's generated. So you need to store it. So lithium-ion batteries are great, but they're hugely polluting, hugely heavy, take up a huge amount of real estate. So this idea, it's been around for a while, but now it's just come to my attention. They've got some demos working, and they're going to have much bigger demos in the future. Basically what it does is it uses gravity. So during the day, you use solar and wind power, whatever, to raise a big weight. So a huge lift shaft, huge 25-ton weight, and that will be bigger in the future as well. You use the electric motors generated or powered by the generated electricity to raise the weight. And then at night, when you need the electricity, you release the weight, and as it drops down, those same motors become generators and they generate electricity. And there are patents for multiple weights and all sorts of things, so it's quite interesting and complicated. But the interesting stats are that you can power 13,000 houses for 2 days, or you can release a sort of a 10 megawatt hour burst just by dropping this thing super quickly. And as soon as you need the electricity as well, which is one of the big things, is how do you get the electricity you need in pulses that you didn't quite predict you needed. So, flattening kind of curves of energy demand, those sorts of things. And this thing, as soon as you say we need the energy, you drop the weight and it can be up and running within less than a second. So that's quite interesting as well. And finally, there was a really interesting, not scam, but this was, I guess, a life hack. So that if you are a delivery driver, especially with Amazon, what they did is they said, well, if you're around their big grocery stores or any sort of client, I guess, that has a lot of Amazon deliveries or requires pickup from Amazon deliveries, then you would get the job if you were close to that warehouse. And therefore you were close to the warehouse if your phone was saying you were close to the warehouse. So what a lot of drivers were doing were leaving mobile phones in trees and then just syncing their phone that they had on them with the data in the tree, so that they can say, well, the tree was saying I'm right next to the warehouse, so the tree would receive the job, and then they would just say, oh, I've got the job, great, and go and pick up the job. So clearly, if you weren't near the warehouse, you would have to drive there, and it was kind of artificially causing a lot of issues. Amazon became aware of this, and I've written a few bits of code which had exclusion zones around their major customers. I just thought it was a really interesting life hack. People were people were stood next to the trees, essentially, sort of minding the phones, so that other people. So, there's a great tech hack in this, but there's also this gig economy. People are starting to find that you have to kind of scam the gig economy to get more out of the gig economy, and this is just one way of doing it. So it's kind of a little bit not so great, but also really ingenious at the same time. Again, it's been found out, the loophole's been closed, but watch out for the next one. So with that, we're done. So thank you very much, and I will see you next week.